Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Sophie Hamilton, and it is my pleasure to host this afternoon's 7th Literary Festival event. Next, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all friends of Berwick Parks, to those who support the parks and help in them in various ways, and to those who enjoy and walk in the parks. This year's Berwick's Open Garden Days could only take place virtually, but the image can still be found on the park's website. And now, of course, a particularly warm welcome to our speaker, Ursula Buchan. I know this afternoon's presentation is going to be extra special because last year, Ursula gave a fantastic illustrated talk on her biography of her grandfather, the writer John Buchan. The amount of fascinating information she managed to squeeze into her allotted hour was quite astonishing. So it is wonderful that she is with us here again. Ursula originally graduated from Cambridge with a degree in modern history, and she then embarked on a career in horticulture and in horticultural journalism. She has written extensively on the subject and brings to this book, A Green and Pleasant Land, her love of gardening as well as her investigative skills. Whether or not 75 years ago the country managed to dig for victory, Ursula has dug very deep to uncover a wealth of information on the country's horticultural activities during the war and their outcomes. She tells us about the significant characters, about research, and about social change. To some extent, it will resonate with those of us who have been gardening like mad during lockdown, but it has to be remembered that the strange times then lasted for over 5 years, which is quite a salutary thought. It is my pleasure now to press my mute button and leave things to you, Ursula.
Thank you, Sophie, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for signing up to this talk. Last year, as you remember, we were beset by floods and driving rain the day I came to speak about John Buchan in Berwick. But it was still a great pleasure to meet some of you and to spend some time in such a wonderful town. Anyway, well done to the tech team for setting this up so that I can talk, even if sadly I can't see or hear you. Even so, I hope very much that you'll enjoy the next 40 minutes or so and will then feel free to ask any sort of question. In 1918, Churchill told the poet Siegfried Sassoon that, and I quote, "War is the normal occupation of man, war and gardening." And this outrageous remark, as I discovered as I did my research on my book, A Green and Pleasant Land, How England's Gardeners Fought the Second World War, actually contains more truth in it than you might think. Certainly, between 1939 and 1945 in Britain, war and gardening were different coloured strands of national life, which surprisingly often became entwined. I didn't have much inkling of this before I first embarked on the book, since there is so little on wartime gardening in most social histories of our time. I thought I knew about the extraordinary success of the Dig for Victory campaign in getting people to grow their own fruit and vegetables, and the soaring numbers of wartime allotments, but not much more. What impelled me to write this book was the realization that gardening during the war exemplified, in microcosm, some pretty big themes on the home front. Themes like the role of propaganda and myth in war, the relationship between government and governed, the changing status of women, the ability of people to carry on normally in abnormal circumstances, the natural resilience and fortitude of the civilian population, and so on. And as I burrowed in the National Archives at Kew, I discovered something that I really didn't expect. The gardening, of all things, was consciously used by the authorities as a means of demonstrating to people something of what their country stood for, particularly its innocent pastimes, in order to make them fight all the harder to preserve it. In other words, gardening was one way of giving people a sense of common purpose elevated above their own self-interest. This promotion of gardening to an important role in the national struggle was undoubtedly initiated by the government with the Dig for Victory campaign, which began almost as soon as the war did. But it was strongly supported by professional gardeners, as well as by the print and wireless media. Professional gardeners saw what they cared for crumbling, so they were obviously keen to back up the government in its quest to preserve the nation's well-being in difficult circumstances. And the wartime media could usually be depended upon to cheerlead for the government to avoid the charge of being unpatriotic. In 1939, 2/3 of our food was imported. 2/3, 66%. These days it's 40%, and we still think that's a lot. Extraordinary. In the 1930s, agriculture and commercial horticulture were in steep decline. Great tracts of land weren't cultivated at all. We scarcely grew anything that couldn't be grown cheaper elsewhere, apart from potatoes. Even onions and carrots mostly came from Holland and Belgium. The German submarine blockade had almost succeeded in bringing Britain to its knees towards the end of the First World War. So it was obvious that foreign imports would be severely limited during the Second. A substantial minority of the 46 million population was undernourished even before war broke out, mainly as a result of the Depression. No wonder the government was so keen to see that farmers increased productivity and gardeners grew their own vegetables. There was also the ticklish but very important question of morale. In 1939, the British government simply didn't know how the civilian population would react to the inevitable aerial bombardment and the threat of invasion. And pre-war, at least, they didn't really trust the people to behave themselves or not to become a nuisance. In 1938, a report by eminent psychiatrists submitted to the Ministry of Health suggested that serious bouts of hysteria were a distinct possibility if the country was bombed, with psychiatric casualties exceeding physical ones by as much as 3-1. As we know now, nothing of the kind happened, and that with insignificant exceptions, the civilian population remained remarkably steady under fire. But it was an understandable anxiety and led the government to conclude that the best way of preventing such a catastrophe was to keep people busily and fruitfully occupied. And what could be better, more healthy, more calming, than spending any spare time you had cultivating the garden or allotment? On the 5th of September 1939, so only 2 days after war broke out, G.W. Giles, who was the secretary of the National Allotment Society, told the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries, a man called Reginald Dorman Smith, that the latter's predecessor, Lord Ernley, believed that cultivating allotments had done more than anything else, I quote, to steady the nation's nerves during the First World War. Giles also reminded Dorman Smith that he'd once said, and again I quote, that the recreational and health-giving properties of allotments were probably of more importance than the produce grown upon them. That turned out to be prophetic. The Ministry of Agriculture got the message. 3 days later, a civil servant in the ministry wrote, "Stress should be laid on the need for as large an increase as possible in the number of allotments, not only on account of the importance of augmenting the quantity of health-giving foodstuffs, but also because of the steadying effect. The steadying effect of work on plots on the large body of persons who will be concerned with allotment work." Over the years, a myth has grown up about this aspect of civilian life during wartime. The Dig for Victory campaign has become almost synonymous with hard-pressed civilians battling to play their full part on the home front. The story of the rip-roaring success of this campaign has been told and retold by those still alive who lived through the war, by some social historians, and even by modern politicians keen to invoke the austerity and self-help image of 1940 to promote their own modern green agendas. But was it true? Was it true? There was certainly plenty of fakery around at the time. You know that famous picture of the smiling milkman picking his way over the rubble after a heavy night of bombing during the Blitz? That was a fake. And so too was the iconic boot on the spade, which appeared on thousands of posters and millions of leaflets. This picture was taken in a studio. And whenever I look at this picture, I always wonder where the other leg got to. Incidentally, many of the pictures I'm showing you were publicity shots, which is why they've survived in public archives. And it's frankly impossible always to gauge just how accurate a picture they portray. We can almost certainly thank Michael Foot, the leader of the Labour Party in the 1980s, for dreaming up the slogan, "Dig for Victory." Foot was a leader writer for the London Evening Standard in September 1939, and in a couple of unsigned leaders, the phrase was used a number of times. The Ministry of Agriculture's name for the campaign was the much more prosaic "Grow More Food," but the press took up Foot's slogan so enthusiastically that the government bowed to the inevitable and used it throughout the war on a succession of instructional advertisements, pamphlets, posters, and banners. Here, for example, is an appropriate banner on the Royal Exchange in the City of London. This is a picture of soldiers digging in the rubble of Bank Station after it was bombed in January 1941. The two main thrusts of the government campaign were, firstly, to get local authorities and private individuals to release land for what were called wartime allotments, and secondly, to educate novices in successful food growing. The aim was almost to double the number of allotments in the first year, from 800,000 to 1,500,000, and then on to 3 million if possible. In fact, the number never rose much above 1.5 million. They also encouraged garden owners to dig up their lawns for vegetables or grow them in their flower beds. For propaganda purposes, a number of high-profile places were turned into allotments. Kensington Gardens in London, for example. There's the Albert Memorial in the background. And this is the allotment that was cultivated by the firemen of Red Cross Street Fire Station in London in their spare time. How beautifully neat and tidy and productive, and all within sight of the miraculously saved St. Paul's Cathedral, as well as the Blitz City of London. A very powerful image. Servicemen were encouraged to grow produce on their bases or in the gardens of the many country houses that were requisitioned for service use. Abraham Games, the famous poster artist, designed these two memorable posters to spur on home-based soldiers to grow their own vegetables. So clever, I think, the way the spade morphs into the ship's bow. These striking images undoubtedly influenced servicemen, some of whom did take up the challenge, although they did complain that often what they sowed, someone else reaped after they'd been posted elsewhere. Here are some RAF personnel surveying their pretty impressive handiwork at a wartime flower show. All new gardeners, or victory diggers as they were known by the press, were thought to know very little about kitchen gardening and needed to be taught everything, which is why were so many earnest pamphlets published, as well as instructional films made, explaining how to make a compost heap, how to double dig, make a seed drill, which pests and diseases to look out for, and so on. Can you imagine what it was like to go to the flicks, to forget your troubles, and be forced to sit through a film showing you how to double dig before ever you got to the main feature? The Ministry of Agriculture placed enormous emphasis on its cropping plan in order to ensure that gardeners made the best use of the space they had available. It looked like this. Correct, but really quite complicated and detailed, as you can see. The ministry managed to persuade King George VI and Queen Elizabeth to allow the two teenage princesses to be photographed gardening, in inverted commas, at Windsor Castle, And here they are, our present Queen and the late Princess Margaret Rose, dressed identically, but unsuitably, puzzling over the ministry's cropping plan. And I really love the idea of Princess Margaret wondering where to sow her onions. Newspapers often told heartwarming stories of how enterprising individuals had taken over waste ground or factory surrounds, village greens, derelict gardens, even bomb sites to grow vegetables. And here is Jimmy West, aged 11, in the blitzed East End of London, apparently sowing seed that had been sent from America. We do know that school playing fields were often dug up for allotments, and most school children, or the boys anyway, did gardening one afternoon a week. The boys of the Drury Falls Council School in Hornchurch, seen in this picture, even ran a shop where they sold their produce. Many children of the time remembered those days with affection, and the skills they learned stood them in good stead in the austere years after the war. There's no doubt that working in allotment had a beneficial effect on town and city dwellers. Here are some cheerful-looking allotmenteers from Acton in London, enjoying a tea break. There are countless personal testimonies of the relaxing and peaceful nature of many of the tasks, and the satisfaction that could be derived from the exercise, the camaraderie, and the healthy produce. The greatest heroes of the Dig for Victory campaign were the professional gardeners and park superintendents, who gave their time voluntarily to lay out model allotments in parks and public spaces and lecture local groups of people. And that was at a time when they'd lost their male gardeners to the services and were having to do with retired gardeners, women, and school leavers. These park superintendents organised Dig for Victory weeks in their towns, putting up displays in town halls with gardening and livestock experts on hand. There were 420 of these in 1942 alone. Sometimes Freddie Griswood, C.H. Middleton, or another figure would be invited along to talk at an evening meeting. I doubt if any professional gardener made more wartime effort than C.H. Middleton. Here he is. He's the chap on the left. Indeed, he died of overwork just before the end of the war. Always known in public as Mr. Middleton, he was a rural science teacher spotted by the BBC in the mid-1930s, and he became the voice of radio gardening with his Sunday afternoon programme, In Your Garden. With his trademark curly-brimmed hat and his owlish glasses, he was the voice of rural common sense. He had the most successful newspaper column too, the one in the Daily Express. He was the Alan Titchmarsh of his time. The other popular live radio programme was Radio Allotment, recorded at an allotment in Park Crescent in London, which was dug and tended by bright young things from the BBC at nearby Broadcasting House. Amongst them were men who would become famous commentators, such as Winford Vaughan Thomas on the left in the check shirt and Raymond Glendenning on the right. The allotment was Roy Hayes' idea. He's the chap standing on the right, next to Michael Standing, who reported from the Normandy beaches on D-Day. A Scots gardener, Roy Hay advised the Minivag on the Dig for Victory campaign, and it amuses me to think of those clever young men honing their broadcasting skills by describing planting tomatoes or sowing carrots. However, there were a number of factors understandably working against the general success of the Dig for Victory campaign. For example, some local authorities were reluctant to release land for allotments, or they didn't have suitable land to release. But even where they did their part, there was not always complete take-up, and many allotments lay fallow. Despite what the gardening papers were saying about the widespread enthusiasm in towns and cities, their story was more upbeat than the facts warranted. The reasons aren't far to seek. People worried a lot about security of tenure with wartime allotments. There was also widespread thieving, as well as malicious or inadvertent damage, since these allotments weren't fenced. A whole range of domesticated and wild stock, from dogs and cats to sheep and rats, were a confounded nuisance as well. Allotments in cities were sometimes bombed, and there was a progressive shortage of tools, seed like onions and potatoes, Wellington boots, manures, and fertilizers. Before the war, the allotment had been seen as an almost exclusively male domain. But as most young men were conscripted practically from the word go, and older men had to get involved in war work, wartime vegetable gardening inevitably became the province of women and retired men. Some 10,000 allotments were rented in women's names, and there were probably thousands more rented in their husbands' names. A few women's allotment associations were founded. Generally, however, urban women don't appear to have been that anxious to get involved with allotments. They preferred to grow vegetables in their gardens if they had one. What is more, by 1943, all women under the age of 51 were forced to do at least part-time war work, since there was such a shortage of labour for the factories. It's easy to see why they gave up on allotment gardening, or never bothered to take it up in the first place. Here's a picture of Roy Hay showing members of the Westminster unit of the Girls' Training Corps how to remove the grass prior to digging in the garden of 145 Piccadilly in London, which had previously been home to the King and Queen. It had also recently been bombed. This publicity shot underlines some of the difficulties and likely disappointments inherent in the Dig for Victory campaign. These 16-year-old girls are politely looking on, but you can see it's going to be difficult for them. And it doesn't help that they're being shown the hardest, most grueling, least obviously rewarding task. Even those people who did take up vegetable gardening with a will were often not very good at it, even well into the war. Or so the Ministry of Agriculture discovered from a commissioned survey in the summer of 1942, which showed that the average production of vegetables in gardens and allotments was only half of what officials considered it should have been. In particular, there was the problem of feast and famine, too much in the summer, little or nothing in the winter. Gardeners seemed reluctant to grow the boring but vital winter vegetables like cabbages, kale, and leeks. More important still, only half of all households were growing vegetables at all. The report concluded that, and I quote, "There remains a very considerable amount to be done before the Ministry of Agriculture really has gardening habits in this country under anything like complete control." I think it's really a wonder they ever thought they could. The report's authors couldn't resist criticising new allotment holders for the quality of their cultivations. There were apparently numerous examples of crop failure through the omission of elementary precautions. The final conclusion was that the campaign, the Dig for Victory campaign, and I quote, "has been fairly satisfactory throughout the war." Fairly satisfactory is scarcely a resounding success. Even so, there is ample evidence that gardening in wartime played its part in keeping many people sane and grounded, giving them space away from their anxieties and connecting them with other people in a positive way. For example, Mrs. Clara Milburn, who had a son captured at Dunkirk in June 1940, who then had to spend 5 years in a prisoner of war camp in Germany, she wrote a diary throughout the war and often sought refuge working in the garden when the news was particularly bad. Her son Alan took up gardening in the German prison camp and shared his experiences by letter with his mother, which she faithfully copied. She, like many others, used gardening as a coping mechanism. And talking of prison camps, the Royal Horticultural Society worked hard during the war in a variety of ways, but especially in sending out seed packets to POW camps under the auspices of the Red Cross. The RHS also sent out gardening books and examination papers so that service personnel could study for the RHS exams and even take them invigilated by their sergeants. Gardens undoubtedly raised morale both in the European camps and in the internment camps in the Far East. It does look as if public parks and gardens were especially important to people in towns and cities, particularly since holidays away from home were almost impossible to organise in wartime. I was trained as a gardener at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, so I'll use it as an example of the value of a public garden and park in wartime. Kew closed on the day war broke out in order to construct air raid shelters and evacuate the most valuable of the botanical collections. But the gardens were open again by the end of September 1939, and they stayed open all through the war. The entrance fee was only 1 penny, so the gardens became an important green space for South Londoners. In fact, visitor numbers actually went up during the war. And here are some service personnel enjoying the pitcher plants in one of the glass houses. Women gardeners mainly replaced the men who'd been called up into the services. There hadn't been any women working outside at Kew since the First World War, and they were mocked mercilessly at first until they more than proved their worth. These women grew vegetables and fruit in flower borders and in the glass houses, hundreds of tons a year. A model allotment was set out near the orangery and cropped according to the Ministry of Agriculture's Dig for Victory leaflets. Kew was bombed from time to time, not surprisingly, considering its position on the Thames in southwest London. One night, 30 high explosive bombs broke a lot of glass in the temperate and palm houses and badly damaged the tropical water lily house. If you look carefully, you can see that a number of the panes have been boarded up on the palm house. And it must have been a terrible job to replace those panes in wartime, especially as they are curved. Incidentally, you can see that flower gardening was much simpler during the war. No extravagant and exotic annual bedding in front of the palm house, just roses and clipped shrubs. Kew was allowed to heat their glass houses because they contained nationally important collections of tropical and subtropical plants. And here is Mr. R. Halsey in 1943, hauling coal along the quarter-mile tunnel under the palm house. And here he is stoking the 2 enormous palm house boilers. Perhaps surprisingly, the more ornamental aspects of Kew Gardens were not entirely neglected. Here's a young lad keeping the tradition of growing Victoria Amazonica alive, despite the tropical water lily house having been damaged by bombs. People soon got used to seeing women working at Kew and in a great variety of other horticultural situations. For example, women took over much of the work in country house gardens, market gardens, seed farms, and commercial nursery operations. Many large country houses were requisitioned by the government and other public bodies at the beginning of the war, as hospitals, convalescent homes, schools, or as bases for the army. Of course, the large walled gardens on country estates had always been geared up to feed large families as well as servants all year round, and so they went over to wartime food production easily enough. The Women's Land Army took the strain, along with middle-aged and retired gardeners. And here are a couple of women being trained in the frame yard of Cannington College in Somerset. Some women's horticultural colleges also kept going during the war, and one of the most distinguished was Waterperry in Oxfordshire, owned and run by the redoubtable and unique Miss Beatrix Havergal. Here she is in her trademark collar and tie, smock and Panama hat. She was the model for Miss Trunchbull in Roald Dahl's Matilda, although only in appearance because she was notably kind. This picture, like the following 2, was taken by Cecil Beaton in 1943. The already famous fashion photographer was employed by the Ministry of Information to take pictures of both civilian and service life for the purposes of boosting morale. Miss Havergal had fantastically high standards, so the girls worked incredibly hard. This picture is almost painterly in its composition and shows what a talented photographer Cecil Beaton was. And here Miss Havergal is teaching her girls to prune pear cordons trained against a wall. What excitement those well-brought-up, sheltered girls must have felt when a glamorous photographer arrived to take their pictures. Women worked in commercial nurseries as well. These were generally in a terrible fix at the beginning of the war. Nursery owners were forced to sell their ornamental plants quickly and cheaply before they turned their land and glasshouses over to market gardening, and their rare plants were often lost because there was either no space for them or there was no one left to look after them properly. And vegetables were much less profitable than nursery stock, obviously. Harry Wheatcroft, the flamboyant rose grower with the handlebar moustache and the loud check suits, he reckoned he lost £100,000 during the war, which would be £4 million in today's money. Almost unbelievably, some keen gardeners were determined to carry on almost as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. They still paid their Royal Horticultural Society membership fees, they wrote scholarly articles in the Society's journal, and they published learned botanical monographs, most notably Sir Daniel Hall's magisterial work on the genus Tulipa. The colour illustrated upmarket magazine My Garden hardly ever mentioned the kitchen garden at all. This was partly a brave fist shaken at fate, but also I think sometimes just a desire to escape from worldly cares and occupy yourself with more enduring things. Leonard Woolf, husband of Virginia, wrote in his autobiography, Downhill All the Way, about the day Virginia called him in from the garden to listen to Adolf Hitler on the wireless. He refused, saying that the irises he was planting would still be there long after Hitler was dead and gone. And of course, he was right. The government's relentless drive to get British farmers and gardeners to produce more food stemmed from a very real fear that the nation might starve, thanks to the enormous losses to merchant shipping as a result of the submarine menace in the Atlantic. Lord Woolton, the Minister of Food, remains one of the great heroes of the war for his single-minded drive to prevent this. One of the most public aspects of this determination was the 5-minute morning radio broadcast called The Kitchen Front. This was light-hearted but informative, and it was aimed at housewives before they went out shopping. The broadcast usually included a recipe, which used what ingredients were widely available at the time, some of them decidedly strange. On the radio and also in books and magazines, housewives were taught how to bottle fruit without sugar, how to dry and store apple rings, how to salt runner beans for winter use. And there was much emphasis on not wasting food. A popular ditty of the time ran, "Those who have the will to win cook potatoes in their skin, knowing that the sight of peelings deeply hurts Lord Woolton's feelings." Since meat was rationed so severely, vegetable dishes, such as the famous Woolton pie, were concocted together with puddings that didn't use too much sugar, also severely rationed, or oranges, lemons, and bananas, which were virtually unobtainable for long stretches of the war. Lord Woolton was particularly concerned to stabilise or even improve the health of children. Hence the emphasis on the growing and eating of carrots, high in vitamin A, to stop children suffering from night blindness. Carrots were promoted as a suitable, naturally sweet alternative to rationed ice cream or sweets, although it's doubtful whether many children could be persuaded to eat carrot lollies, especially at a penny a pop. One of the most useful initiatives for improving children's health in wartime came about as a result of Kew Gardens' research into rose hips. Vitamin C was particularly important for infants and small children who didn't eat many green vegetables. Kew decided in the end to concentrate mainly on the native dog rose, Rosa canina, which was to be found in every hedgerow and which made a delicious syrup. Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, school children, and Women's Institute members collected these hips for a modest cash payment. And here's a picture of girls in what had been an ice cream factory in Acton. They're milling the rose hips prior to boiling them. The government aimed at an annual target figure of 1,500 tonnes, but never in the war did those volunteers achieve anything more than a third of that. The children were very willing, but the scale of the task was simply beyond them. Nevertheless, by February 1942, rosehip syrup was available from chemists, and it was given free to children of school age and below. The Women's Institutes not only picked rosehips, but they also grew herbs, collected native plants for medicinal purposes, knitted, made gloves and hats from rabbit skins, and importantly, were taught by professionals how to cultivate the vegetable gardens that their menfolk had left behind. On the whole, country women became very accomplished gardeners. But the Women's Institutes became known to the whole nation when they decided to make jam and can fruit, when there was a glut of plums in gardens and orchards in August 1940. And here they are, learning about canning and jamming fruit as depicted by Evelyn Dunbar. She was an official war artist, one of the very few women commissioned for the work, who painted mainly country scenes. And I love the look on the members' faces, especially the woman with her arms crossed. No one is going to teach her anything about the domestic arts. And here's the Women's Institute from Merryworth in Kent, making jam. As you'd expect, since it's the WI, it's a very orderly process. As a result of this war work, even now, any newspaper article about the Women's Institute is usually entitled Jam and Jerusalem. However, it has to be said that despite an enormous amount of selfless work every summer and autumn for 5 years, the WI only succeeded in making a tiny percentage of the national requirement for ration jam, enough for 100,000 people out of 46 million. All that slaving over a hot stove was largely symbolic. It's my belief that the WI's most important contribution to the war effort, and it was important, was that they allowed themselves to be harnessed to the Ministry of Agriculture's publicity machine. Again, it was all about raising civilian morale. It wasn't only vegetables and fruit that people were encouraged to nurture in wartime. Domestic livestock were also on the list. Chickens, ducks, geese, pigs, rabbits, and goats were all recommended as suitable for those people who had gardens. Chickens turned out to be easy enough, apart from the difficulty in obtaining wire netting for the coops, but ducks and geese could cause hygiene problems in the average suburban garden, and pigs even more so. So they tended to be kept only by country people or by cooperative pig clubs. And here are National Fire Service officers who ran a pig club, rounding up their charges in some Blitz ruins in London. The social benefits of keeping pigs were frequently stressed. Early in the war, the Times carried an editorial singing the praises of pig clubs, not only for the meat and manure they produced, but for the pigs' capacity to cheer up their keepers. Goats were altogether another matter. They turned out to be even more omnivorous than pigs, so most people got rid of them after they'd eaten their delphiniums and gardening gloves. Rabbits could be kept as easily in cities as in the country, and a buck and 4 does would provide a weekly meal for a household all year round. The fur could be used for gloves or other clothes, and apparently it took 40 rabbits to make a fur coat. Rabbit fur coats would have come in very handy in the famously cold winter of 1947. Bees were kept mainly in large gardens and orchards in the countryside. And here is a Mr. S. Dodsley of Rowney Green, Worcestershire, feeding his bees with a sugar and water solution to keep them going through the winter of 1943. And I'm glad to see he liked to work in a bow tie and detachable collar. In truth, despite plenty of encouraging government advice, livestock keeping was never more than a minority interest, especially in towns. Life for civilians didn't get any easier once the war finished in 1945. Indeed, food rationing became even tighter as Britain tried to help out the starving peoples of mainland Europe. And the American Lend-Lease program, which had brought powdered eggs and spam into the country, stopped abruptly. Wartime allotments were swiftly taken back by councils in a push to build much-needed houses on the land. So much so that the number of post-war allotments fell quickly back below 1 million. Most of the wartime gains had been lost. In any event, despite the government's best endeavours to keep up the momentum at the end of the war and beyond, people were so tired and browned off, as they used to say, that they couldn't be cajoled into doing much more. Indeed, many people couldn't wait to put back their lawns and flower beds and get rid of the chickens. Women lost their jobs in many commercial nursery operations, as well as public gardens, when the men came home. There were only 6 women left at Kew in 1946, and the Women's Land Army was disbanded in 1950. As for the system of private service gardening in large houses, it simply couldn't survive the raised expectations and wages after the war, coupled with crippling tax hikes and death duties for country house owners. The country houses themselves had suffered terribly in wartime, from wanton destruction by the troops billeted in them, or just from 6 years of neglect and lack of maintenance. The elaborate system of horticultural apprenticeship, which had flourished in those gardens since late Georgian times, almost completely disappeared, and with it, a number of complex horticultural skills, especially in the cultivation of orchids and glasshouse fruit. Commercial nurseries got back to something approaching normality in a few years, although customers couldn't expect to get exactly what they ordered until well into the 1950s. Some of those that had served grand customers before the war never recovered and went bust. In conclusion, what can I say about gardening during the war? It seems that it did prove to be one important way that civilians, as well as service personnel and prisoners of war, mitigated the shocks and griefs, as well as the very limited variety in food that they were forced to endure in wartime. For a substantial minority of the population, it also proved an important and usually pleasurable way of spending scarce leisure hours. And even all those millions who didn't participate were pleased to think that others dug for victory. It's true that the government wasn't always entirely straight with the people about the success or otherwise of their campaigns, but it seems harsh to be censorious about that. The Dig for Victory campaign was, after all, at its most energetic in the autumn of 1940, when things really did look pretty dark for the nation. And finally, the memory of wartime gardening engendered a powerful, but let's face it, pretty benign cultural myth, that of the whole nation pulling together to grow their own produce, which has resonated down the years to this day. A myth, ladies and gentlemen, which I'm sure will survive whatever my book says. Thank you for listening.
Oh gosh, many, many thanks for a wonderful talk. Your book has been described by the BBC Countryfile as like an extremely rich fruit cake packed with all sorts of ingredients, and there is just so much there. And it's so easy to forget the amount of preparation necessary to convert a full book with so much information in it to a 45-minute presentation. But I think you did wonderfully well. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We have a look now at any questions. There's a question here. Where did all your photographs come from?
Oh, well, they're mostly from public collections, so they're available. I mean, they cost money to reproduce, obviously. Though I don't think they're all still in copyright, actually. Some were, some weren't. So I had great fun finding them, actually, and some of them just make me hoot with laughter, really. I love the children looking at the carrot ice lollies, for instance. You know, they were...
Yeah, I was interested in that because you were saying that the idea of the carrots was linked to effects on children's sight if they
Yes.
didn't get... Is it vitamin A?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, they were worried about their night sight, particularly.
Yes.
So, and children would not necessarily eat all their vegetables. That was a problem, you know, particularly not the leaf ones, the brassicas and things.
Right.
So I mean, I think the government, particularly the Ministry of Food, did an absolutely fantastic job to stop. That nobody starved in the war. In fact, it's always said that that many children were healthier at the end of the war than at the beginning, because though there was rationing, they were getting probably a more balanced diet than they would have had in the 30s.
Right. Yes. I was wondering about the figure too on the amount of fresh veg. That it was not as much as the government hoped, but I wonder actually how much fresh veg would have been eaten even before the war.
Well, yes, possibly, probably not, particularly not in the cities. No.
Yeah.
And I mean, the civil servants worked extremely hard, but I think they did sometimes have a rather overinflated idea of what was possible. Because you were changing people's habits. And when they had so much else going on in their lives as well, it wasn't always possible to change those habits.
Yeah, were you surprised in a way? I mean, I thought it was amazing how effectively things were changed. I mean, when you see all these, I know perhaps some of them were staged for the photographs, or they were taken at particular places which were very well organized, but they did get themselves set up pretty quickly, really. And where did all the tools come from?
Well, I mean, that became progressively more of a problem. Even worse were once the Japanese had invaded Malaya, the rubber ran out. So Wellingtons became very difficult to get later in the war. I think people, they dug out whatever they had, country houses, lent them, that sort of thing. But I think tools, the lack of tools was a problem, particularly as the war went on. I mean, people were pretty ingenious, but even so, there were sometimes insuperable problems. Yeah. Even if people had the desire to do it, they couldn't for a number of reasons. Right. And for instance, potash before the war mainly came from Germany and Poland. So of course that dried up immediately when war was declared. So suddenly there wasn't much potash at all, and it's a very, very important vegetable fertilizer.
Right. Yes.
The fertilizer Grow More actually dates from this time. It was developed during the war as a very useful, balanced fertilizer for allotment growing.
Yeah, actually, and that's
still get it today. Today.
There's yes, that's an aspect that you cover in your book, actually, about the development of fertilizers and growing mediums and so forth, isn't it?
John Innes composts were developed during the war. Very important. Still available. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh well. And the other thing I was amused, because you said really animal keeping didn't expand to that extent, but I was amazed by the number of pigs kept in was it Paddington? 3,300.
Yes, I know. And the dustbin men in Tottenham, they had a pig club, and people would put their kitchen scrapings into a sort of bucket on the dustbin lorry.
Yes.
Which would be taken, and now of course it would go to a sort of composter, But in those days it went to the pigs.
Went straight to the pigs.
In suburban and urban streets there would be, pig bins, and people would put their kitchen waste in there for the local pig club.
Maybe that's a lesson actually for us more.
Yeah. But I mean, in order for that all to happen, a lot of regulations had to be sort of stopped for the duration, because mostly you're not allowed to keep pigs in towns, or certainly not now.
No. Is there a favourite vegetable that people grew?
Yes, good question. It tended to be the nice ones, the salads and beetroots and tomatoes, things like that's what people like to grow.
Right.
What they didn't like was growing brassicas, because there was so many problems involved with them. So yes, they actually like what we like to grow. But what worried the government was that it didn't make a lot of difference, or not as much difference as they thought, to how much people bought in the shops.
Right.
So they thought, well, people are growing their own, but they're also buying. Why? I don't think they ever got to the bottom of that, really.
No. And how easy was it to get seeds?
Oh, well, progressively more and more difficult. Suttons, I mean, there were lots of seedsmen, but of course they were they had to depend on female labour, mainly during the war, and standards had to slip, not because they were female labour, but because there were, fewer people working for them. And also a lot of seed had been, in the past, had been grown in warmer climates, in North Africa, for instance, because of a better climate. And of course, North Africa was the scene of a lot of fighting during the war. And so very difficult, seed because it was small could come in on the ships and things, but there was always the risk that the ship would be by a submarine,
Was cider making and other alcoholic offshoots of veg and fruit popular or possible?
It was certainly both possible. Well, I think possible if you already had the kit. And certainly, I think probably extremely popular. Quite a lot of homemade wine, sort of cowslip wine, things like that were made during the war. Things that people could pick.
Yes.
We don't pick cowslips now, but people certainly did during the war. And other things, rhubarb could be used. Making alcoholic drinks, and people did if they could.
Yeah.
If only because the beer was watered down that you bought in pubs. So
so they could make something
really alcoholic, make it yourself.
Yeah. Is the government plan blueprint for allotments available anywhere? It's another question.
What the government papers? They're all available in the National Archives. Yes.
Right, yes. At Kew.
At Kew. Yes.
Right.
I mean, I spent many a happy hour in the National Archives and reading papers. A lot of them I don't think anybody looked at since the war, really. But I don't think anything is still embargoed. I think it's all there.
Right. Oh. Another thing I wondered, I think a lot of us during the recent lockdown, and obviously for a lot of people during the war and in the prison camps, etc., and internment camps, gardening was a wonderful relief, and it could be a wonderful distraction. And I wonder what you feel, whether it's used enough in places like prisons and in areas, perhaps even sort of psychiatric settings and things, that we use it enough, that we encourage it enough.
Well, that's a very interesting point. I think there's been a real sea change in the last few years. A great many small charities have been set up with a horticultural element to them. Charities for the homeless, or the drug addicted, or the abused, or physically or mentally disabled. They will have horticultural programs, and that's because the evidence is overwhelming now of the beneficial effects of being outside and gardening and getting your hands dirty and in the soil and seeing the sowing seeds and germinating and all and eating what you've grown. And so I think, and there have been some very good books recently published on this. Sue Stuart-Smith's book on I can't remember what it's called, The Well Garden Mind.
Right.
A lot of research in that, or she's drawn a lot of research, drawn the findings that gardening is extremely beneficial.
Yeah, good.
And I think, we all know, didn't we, particularly in lockdown, those of us who were fortunate enough to have a garden, we spent as much time as we possibly could, didn't we?
Well, I'm going to read you a message here that's come up, which I think is lovely. Thank you for a wonderful talk. You're an amazing author. I loved your Buchan biography. As an admirer of his works, you gave me the insight into his mind and provided the historical context. Thank you. Your new book is going to be my Christmas present to many colleagues in America and here. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, that's very nice.
Really nice.
Thank you very much for that. That's brilliant. Yeah.
Right, now then, we are now coming to the end of our allotted time, so just a few reminders. Ursula's book is entitled A Green and Pleasant Land, published by Windmill Books and available in Greaves, the bookseller in Berwick, and I'm sure available via all good bookshops. Do also look at Ursula's bibliography, because she has published many other beautiful books about gardening. The chat button can now be used to leave a donation if you care to do so, and would be much appreciated, as we're all volunteers and receive no official sponsorship. And we are very grateful for the generosity shown so far and delighted by the size of our audiences and their geographical spreads. Really exciting. Again, many thanks to you, Ursula, and goodbye to everyone, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Sophie. It's been a great pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Good, and me too. Thank you.